Welcome to the Saints Crown Show. This is a show for men who want to grow. In a world where confusion is the culture and passivity is the practice, we exist to take men from gaining massive clarity to taking massive action, because we believe that if we can help bring order to your life, you can bring order to your world.
So welcome to the Saints Crown Show. I'm your host, Zachary Reed, and I'm joined here today with co-founder of Saints Crown, Preston Woody. And the vision of Saints Crown is to take men from massive clarity to massive action. So today we are actually going to be talking about what is the Saints Crown podcast, and I'm excited to dive in.
We're going to have so much stinking fun today, Zach, and thank you for hosting today. And I want to talk quickly about what is this show. Yeah. Ultimately, this is, Zach, it's a show designed for a specific person. It's a show designed for men who desire to grow. A show desired for men who want to grow. And in a world where confusion is the culture, and passivity is practice. Men are very confused. Men are very passive. What do we exist to do? Well, it's the vision of our company is we exist to take men from gaining massive clarity to taking massive action. And why? It's because we believe that if we can help bring order to a man's life, that man can go and bring order to his world. So that's the heart of what we're doing, and I'm excited to unpack it with you.
Yes. One of the things I'm thinking about too is why is it important to have massive clarity in your world? Why do we as men need to have massive clarity?
I believe, Zach, that complexity is the enemy of execution. And the reason in our life that we don't have massive results oftentimes. Sometimes we have incremental results in what we do, such as if you lift weights at 50% intensity, then what sort of results are you going to get? You're going to get 50% results. But if you're lifting at 80 to a 90% intensity, what kind of results are you going to get? 80 to 90% results. So the intensity in which we apply will be the intensity of our results, but the intensity in which we apply is based on the intensity of the clarity that we have. Because complexity is the enemy of execution. We don't do things because the reason why we don't do things is because we're still in a space of fog or indecision. So we believe that if we want massive results, we have to take massive action. In order to take massive action, we have to gain massive clarity. Think about the election cycles. Is there many people not voting? Why aren't people voting? Because they're so confused. They're confused at all of the propaganda and the variables of what's going on and who's doing what. And the reason people aren't taking action is because there's so much confusion. So what we hope to do is help bring people to a point of deeper clarity, because confusion, I think, is killing the hearts and souls of men today.
So good. And I'm thinking about how we met, and I needed clarity on my own life. And so maybe we talk about that a little bit, how we met, how this all came to be, and even just the men's group that we had the opportunity to steward together at our church, and kind of dive into who this podcast is really meant for. Because I'm thinking as we're talking about who this is for, I'm thinking of me when we met 2 years ago. So let's dive into that a little bit. I think I'm curious to know what led you to initially start the men's group where I met you.
The starting in the christening of this men's group was because my pastor said, "Hey, you should start a group." And I have a wonderful pastor, and he was walking me through a transition period in my life. And I said, "Well, what do I do next?" And he said, "Well, I think it's time for you guys to start a group." And that's what we did. And I inquired of the Lord as to what I needed to do. And my assignment a couple years prior had been to shape men into fathers and fathers into kings, and decided to stay in that lane and do something to develop and tap into and steward the hearts of men. And that was the origins of this group. So I decided to start something and do it with something different that I've ever done before, with nobody that I knew.
Yeah.
So just people that I'm crossing paths with, that I feel highlighted or drawn to, or feel that sense of magnetism, and began inviting people. And it ended up being a pretty robust group of about 18, 19 of us in, was it 21?
2021. Yeah.
Fall
Season 1.
And it was different than most groups in the sense that we had all of the guys sign on to a character code.
Yes.
Which was something I think that was new to a lot of the guys. Talk to me a little bit about, as I'm sharing this character code, which is like things that you have to abide by to be a part of this group.
Yeah.
Talk to me about your experience as that was being shared.
Well, so before I dive into that, I want to back up a little bit, because we didn't run into each other prior to the group. I was just looking for a group, and to be honest with you, there was probably like, I don't know, we're at a pretty big church, so there was a plethora of options. And I came across yours, and when I read that it was for men who want to take massive action and that it was leadership focused, it was probably the only men's group on there that really like spoke to what I was seeking in that season. So I'm like, I'm just going to join this random group. Like, it looks cool. We'll see what happens. And I'm so grateful that I did, because it was exactly what I needed walking into that new season of life. I was newer to our church, newer to Fort Worth. I had been, prior to that, living in Dallas for about 8 years. And so I was looking for community. And honestly, I was looking for like-minded men that were growth-focused and wanting to just take territory. And so the vision of the group really spoke to me. And so when you were going over the character code inside the group, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm 100% in. And I'm the type of person, you're probably the type of person that is like a 100% in or 100% out individual. It's like, if we're going to commit to doing something, we're taking the mountain and we're going. And so for me, when you were going through the character code, it was like breathing air for me. Like, I'm like, okay, this is exactly what I need in this season. I'm ready for discipline, because I've always craved discipline. I've always appreciated discipline. Now, whether or not I've always fallen through with discipline, that's a totally different discussion. But I was excited for the vision that you were casting through the character code of really like setting ourselves apart and like dedicating this season to being the man that God had called me to be. And so that was my perspective on that.
That's interesting that you bring it up, because in developing that, I knew one or two things would happen as I shared this character code to, I think, 19, 20 guys that were in the room that decided to jump in on that first vision night. One of two things would happen. One, they would hear it and they would say, yes, this is, I can get behind this. Yes. I can rise to this. This is me. Or two, like, whoa, this is a lot. I'm just trying to join a church small group and do a Bible study. Yeah. So talk to me about, what were you thinking as you were hearing those items being shared? Maybe we can jump into a few of them.
Yeah. I think for me, it was not out of the unusual. There were things in there. The one thing I had to really think about was, because there's always an element in the character code that you add in that's your own, like something that you feel like the Lord is speaking to you about in this season to abstain from. And so I can't even remember what I put. Honestly, I think I was a little overwhelmed, because I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do? This is all new. I just, not sure about the guys in this group. Day one, we're talking about this character code. And so I knew that I was excited about it, but I was also kind of like, what am I getting myself into? But also kind of like, I'm here for it. So I didn't really know how to process through that in the moment. But I think for me, the character code, it really established, like, okay, I'm going to follow these like key principles. Do you have the code in front of you, or like, do you
I
remember
think
the
I have
exact things?
much of it by
Yeah.
memory. And what's
It's like no drinking, no pornography.
so the first one was a commitment is I will not have sex with people I'm not married to.
Yes.
It's just a commitment to that integral purity
Yes.
and intimacy and focus, intimacy with your wife, but also focus on your development to begin to carve away the things that produce toxicity in your life. And then second is I will not watch or look at or be involved in any form of pornography.
Yeah.
Which as soon as I said that, I saw like
Everyone's like,
everyone begin to blush,
What?
about 80%
Yeah.
of the room. And it was almost as if maybe they hadn't been formally challenged in that, in a context where they might be held accountable. And it's amazing with, one of the reasons I put that through is in one of my coaching clients, one of the things that we worked on in context of, him having a desire to get married was eliminating pornography from his life and of his lifestyle. And it was something that had been a part of his lifestyle for 10, 15 years. But once it was eliminated and obliterated, he actually found his wife to be 6 months later. Because what happens is when you remove that filter in which you view women, that filter becomes removed and you get to look through the lens of the eyes that God intended you to view women through.
Yes.
And then you get to see women for who they are and not what they can provide or do for you. And so that was one of the things I wanted to add. And I think the third was that the men had to be serving in some context where they weren't being paid.
Yes.
Which is doing something for somebody else that can't do something for you. And then finally was the item of what's one thing that I'm going to abstain from for the next 90 days of one thing that I have in my life that might be good, but it's in the way of great. So to cut that one thing away.
And I feel like there's so many paths we could go down just within that first season, that first group. I know that we've got some time slotted to kind of dive into some of those things in some additional episodes. But I think it's great because that's where we met. That's where we started building relationship. And then from there, fast forward 2 years later, here we are, because really that was 2 years ago. And there's so much that's happened over those last 2 years. We've had the opportunity, or I've had the opportunity to hear you teach season after season of that men's group, because we kept it going since the 2-year mark. Yes. And then this last season, being able to co-lead with you is awesome. And just such a great, like, fulfilling experience to get to pour into men's lives and then see in real time the transformation that is occurring and the aha moments that they're having, and get them into, like, seeing them passionately pursue after the things of God and living a set apart life through the character code. Was like one of my like favorite highlights over this last year, being able to do that, to then being able to lead men into a 40-hour wilderness experience, which I'm excited to talk about as well on the show. And then also developing the masculine role assessment through the process of having you with you teaching the 4 roles of a man, which has really been a foundational teaching throughout the men's group. Can you briefly dive into literally like the inspiration behind the 4 roles of a man teaching and just that entire process?
When I think of the 4 roles of a man, you think of, okay, who are you to determine or say what the 4 roles of a man are? And the truth behind it is it isn't something that I came up with.
Yeah.
It's actually a download that I actually received in settings, being immersed in the presence of God, presence of my Creator, where downloads of knowledge and understanding that I should have thousands of hours of study to be able to understand and articulate was given to me.
Yeah.
One piece at a time over about a 2-year span. And so it was in maybe 2020 when I held my first life blueprint workshop and was helping some guys get their life in order. And at the end of it, I decided to share and tease and teach on it a little bit. I began teaching about the role of the king, the masculine role of the king and his divine ordination to bring order, and the role of the warrior and the role of the poet and the priest. And the further I got through, the more the guys began to lean in.
Yeah.
And the more I talked about the shadow types, the more interested and wide-eyed they became. And of that entire day-long workshop with this group of 12 to 15 guys, this was the most quiet the room had been. And I realized that what I was saying was piercing the heart and touching the soul. And at that point, I began teaching and developing that framework through those 4 roles and began implementing it in our group. And that was a foundation, and ended up being a foundational part of the group.
Yes.
Like an intro teaching every single season.
I feel like every season it got more rich, more there was more depth to it, because as we were walking it through, I felt like the Lord was just breathing on it. And there were so many details that continued to be added to it every single season when we would introduce it. And so we've had the opportunity since then to build out an assessment for men to actually discover their masculine role, which has been a fun process. Yes. And so full circle, this has just been this entire journey.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, in fact, Zach, interesting you bring that up is it was at the end of our most recent group where you came to me after it. We had taken the men through structures and diving out and articulating the roles and applying it to where you said, hey, I feel like this should be an assessment right after the group. And right then, like I felt like this isn't like a should, it's a have to. We have to do this.
Yes. And there's nothing out there that speaks directly to the role of a man, and giving men permission to operate in the masculine role that they were created to operate in. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit, because I think it ties into the why behind this podcast. Like why is it important, or why is it a necessity that we even have conversations about masculinity in 2023?
Certainly. I mean, and the word masculinity in and of itself. Yeah. It has so many emotions and feelings and perspectives and even political sides attached to it.
Yes.
What is masculinity? Because masculinity is almost attached to that concept of toxic masculinity, which we can get into in a little bit, or in another episode or another time. What is masculinity? Well, masculinity, really by the best definition, is characteristics and responsibilities typically attributed to men. And I say typically attributed to men because when men abdicate their masculine responsibility, women have to take them up. And I think that that is beautifully illustrated in the Lord of the Rings. Have you ever seen Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
In the Two Towers, and there's a shield maiden named Eowyn, and she's a beautiful shield maiden, but she is training and practicing with a sword, and Aragorn, the king of Gondor, comes and kind of stops her in her tracks and kind of challenges her perspective on taking up a sword. He's kind of baffled by it, and she says something extremely riveting. As she says, those without swords can still die upon them. Which is to say, if the men abdicate their responsibility to take up the sword, the women have to.
Yes.
And so women have had to take on masculine traits and responsibilities because it has been abdicated by men in this generation. So we have these two pendulums of being controlling and misogynistic, and we have being passive into a puppet sense. We have
Yes.
tyrants and puppets, but not a lot of assertive men. So what I hope that this show provides is a context of what is a man, what is their responsibility, and how can I bring order in my life so that I can bring order to my world? Because when you're doing that, when you're bringing order to your world, there's nothing more fulfilling. I mean, when we're living in a state of chaos externally, it's typically because it's paralleling our state of chaos internally. So the question I'm asking is, how can we bring chaos internally to these men so they can bring order to their households and then conquer out into the world?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that like there's always going to be chaos. Like there's always going to be chaos, and I think some men not cower back, but they kind of stay in a stagnant position instead of taking the steps to move forward because they're waiting for all of the external factors or things to align and be perfect for things to settle down. And I think it's important to know that as men, we were designed to handle chaos. And that's part of the roles of a man.
Yes.
And so, so we have to be willing at any time to embrace the chaos and bring order to it.
Yes.
And embrace the resistance.
Yes.
And also have a release from the resistance,
Yes.
right? Like the role of the king, the role
Yes.
of the warrior. And so I think it's just important to note that that the action has to happen. Like we need to be taking action now. And I think that it speaks even to the state of masculinity today, and just the level of fatherlessness that we have across the board that really leads to these situations where the feminine roles have to then kick in and take care of all of the children and rise to the occasion and step in an area that is actually suited for the father. And so I think that's just one of the things that we're facing today with masculinity and that being attacked. But also just the fact that we have the ability to implement change and take massive action so that we can affect our world and our families and all of the external factors.
That's good that you put it that way. I think it's time for us to once again become men of action.
Yes.
And in order for us to do that, we have to become men of clarity, and bring more clarity than we bring confusion.
Yes.
And in a world that's filled with confusion, I think it's our responsibility to bring clarity. And I hope through this show that we can do that.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about who this podcast is for and who this podcast maybe not be for. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I think this is a podcast for men, so let's open up that category.
Absolutely.
But not that women can't listen, because I think that a lot of women can listen in the context of observing what a man should be and what they might be looking for or how they can encourage their man. So let's open up that as well. But I don't think that this is for a man who is complacent. What do you think?
I agree. I think even when you think about water that stands still, it's a breeding ground for all kinds of things. And I think that's where the foulness, bitterness, things begin to grow. We have to be in a place and a mentality and a desire to want to grow, to want to get better. And so I think that's who this show is for the man that is saying, hey, I may not be where I want to be, and that's okay. I've identified that, but I want to go to the next level. I want to get clarity so that I can take action.
Yes. And you're talking about a desire to grow.
Yes.
And I think let's add to that is a desire to grow and a willingness to invest in themselves.
Yes.
Because I think that's a bridge some men don't end up crossing. Is I want to grow and I want to change, but I don't see the value enough in myself to invest in myself, some time, resource to read, grow, or be coached, or even financially to bet on myself.
Yes.
So what's the difference between a man who, in your opinion, who is willing to invest in themselves and one who isn't?
I think when you're willing to invest in yourself, it sets the expectation that you're going to grow versus someone who, if you're not willing to bet on yourself, then what are you doing? Like, what are you willing to bet yourself, like, to bet on? You know what I mean? So it's like, I see it as the difference would be.
That's interesting. Well, if you're not willing to bet on yourself, let's unpack that a little bit. What are you betting on? Like, I explore that with me.
I feel like that is that complacent state where now all of a sudden things are happening to you and you switch into a victim mentality that, well, this is just how it is. Had another rough year, had another financial downturn. I've had another thing happen. And I feel like even with complacency, there can be a side of it where it's like, well, I'm just going to wait to be saved. I'm just going to wait for these things to happen. And even in the Word of God, like, it's very clear that we can make our own plans, but the Lord guides and directs our steps, which says that you have to be in motion. Your feet have to be in motion for the Lord to redirect your steps. If you're just standing there, he's not going to redirect your steps because you're not moving. And so I feel like it all comes down to, you have to be in movement. You have to be taking action. And through that process, if you have a humble and teachable heart, the Lord is going to redirect you. And so any kind of action is better than no action. And so,
That's interesting you bring that up. Is you were talking about the Lord directing your steps and moving, but it's interesting that sometimes we move without the massive clarity.
Yeah.
And we gain clarity through the movement.
Yes.
What would you say to someone who feels like they don't have enough clarity to move?
I would say one of the most important things that I feel like I've learned in this season is sometimes you have to slow down a little bit in order to create a stillness inside of you to think about and get clarity on the direction that you're supposed to be running. For me, that looks like my encounter times with the Lord. I know we have a first 5 framework that we'll talk through in another episode. But that is my process that I go through every single day to realign myself with my relationship with the Father, so that I can hear his heart and his mind for my life. And then it's me choosing to get into unity with that. So I think a lot of that comes down to habits and disciplines and things that you have to implement in order to get yourself into a state where you can slow down from the craziness of the world. Again, there's always going to be that chaos. And there has to be a time in your day where you have the ability to realign yourself to your calling and your purpose and like the desires that you have.
Do you think that rest is passive or is it active?
I feel like it is a little bit of both. Like I think it's more active because you have to be present in order to receive clarity.
Yes.
And I think rest is incredibly important because if you're just running all the time and you're not slowing down, then like you will exhaust yourself. And one of my favorite quotes is action without aim leads to exhaustion. And so if you're aimlessly shooting arrows everywhere day to day and you haven't slowed down to get clarity on what is the target, then eventually you're just going to exhaust yourself. And so I feel like you have to have, these, you have to have replenishment centers. You have to know what feeds you for rest. And for me, I believe in a weekly Sabbath, where you actually, it's not even about me doing whatever I want, but it's really me slowing down and kind of like how I have intentional time with the Lord every single day. For me, a Sabbath is a once a week day that's dedicated back to the Lord, where again, I'm slowing down. I'm preparing in advance for that day. so that I'm not overexerting my energy level. And so if you're resting and Sabbathing and creating space for that, then you're going to be able to run faster the other 6 days of the week.
Beautiful, beautifully put. And I hope that this show can be a space of reflection and active rest for those that engage and listen, and a incubator for deep truth.
Yes.
Well, as we close out this episode, any closing thoughts?
I'm thinking I just want to really encourage those who are listening that you don't have to have it all together. I think a lot of shows, a lot of influencers, social media content, you see people and the thought process is, man, they have it all together. And I'm thinking back to the Zach 2 years ago who walked into the small group and I didn't have it all together. I still don't have it all together. And just grateful for the opportunity to receive really what we're going to walk through in this podcast. And we're giving it away to people because we want men to get clarity so that they can take action, so they can see results. And so I just want to encourage the listeners, the people who are watching, that you don't have to get it all or you don't have to have it all together, but we're going to teach you and impart into you the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding that we've received by pouring into men. And I just hope that people find clarity through this process. Because again, if you can find clarity, you can take action, which is the whole heart behind this.
Beautiful. And what I'm hearing you say is you won't be able to always have it all together.
Yeah.
But you can have more order.
Yes. There are some things, there are controllables and uncontrollables in our life. And so if you feel like everything is out of control, then take a pause and look at, okay, what are the things that I can control? I can control my attitude. I can control my response. I can control X, Y, and Z. That, there are the things that we are uncontrollable, and focus on that. Because if you can focus on the things that you do have the power and ability to change and impact, then the rest of it, regardless of the situation, will be impacted by that.
Wonderful. Well, in closing, we want to give you an opportunity to take massive action. So I'm going to ask you a question that can maybe bring you to some clarity is, what is your character code? What is the code that you live by? Or what is a code that you maybe need to live by for at least the next 90 days?
Yes.
Maybe it's the character code that we talked about.
Yeah.
You need to articulate and write those things out and sign your name and date it. And for the next 90 days, this is how I'm going to live my life, and just see what will happen.
Yes. And last thing is, I would also just encourage the viewers and listeners of this show to get a journal. That's something that we always encourage the guys going through our group to do. And don't let this be just another show that you have on in the background. I would encourage you to take time apart to slow down, hear what's being taught, and then journal through the process so that you can see the transformation that you're going to get from this first episode through however many episodes this ends up being in the future. But get into a habit of writing these things down and not just consuming content to consume it.
Excellent. Thanks for joining today. We hope to see you next time on the Saints Crown Show. Thank you for investing in yourself with us. And if you feel like, hey, I found my tribe, right now, go ahead and subscribe to the show. Also, you can go ahead and take your masculine role assessment, or you can just find us on social media at Instagram at saints.crown. I hope to see you soon.